Hello, my name's Sarah Helmer, and I'm the chair of the Geriatric Pharmacology Committee for the Clinical and Translational section of IUPHAR. This video is on clinical trials considerations in drug evaluation for geriatric populations. It is important that clinical trials are conducted as part of drug evaluation in older people. Clinical trials give high-quality evidence on the efficacy of drugs and on common safety issues. It is important to conduct clinical trials in older adults because findings in younger adults are not always generalizable to older adults. This is because of the effects of the physiology of aging, differences in the pathophysiology of disease in old age, the prevalence of drug interactions in the context of multimorbidity and polypharmacy, and the measurement of relevant outcomes for older people. It's important that clinical trial participants are representative of the population likely to use the drugs in practice. And in many cases, that is older people. When we think about geriatric populations, we think firstly of chronological age. Geriatric is considered age 65 years and older. Clearly, there's a wide variation between all people age 65 and older, and people look at subgroups defined as 65 to 75, 75 to 80, and over 80. We're trying to work out the current state of representative recruitment in clinical trials. We need to be able to measure it. And an innovation recently has been development of metrics. For example, in the USA, the participation to prevalence ratio, or PPR, which is the percentage of patients by age subgroup amongst trial participants over the percentage of patients by age subgroup amongst the US prevalent population. As you can see from this data submitted to the FDA, for people aged over 80 with heart failure and non-valvular atrial fibrillation, the participation to prevalence ratio is exceedingly low. There have been a number of strategies developed by academic and regulatory organisations around the world to try to develop toolkits for age-friendly clinical trial design to help people recruit populations that are representative of the geriatric population into clinical trials. A common feature of these is consumer involvement. That includes older people, their caregivers, and geriatricians and other care workers who work with older people. One such framework is the 5 T's framework illustrated here, which includes the target population, making sure there are no unnecessary exclusions, making sure the team includes people who know about older people and older people themselves, taking the extra time it needs to work with older people, tips to accommodate the needs of older people in clinical trials, and using measurement tools that are appropriate and meaningful for older people. When we think about representative recruitment in clinical trials for the geriatric population, we need to think beyond chronological age. Some factors that are present throughout life interact with old age. These include sex and gender and ethnicity, with a lifetime of exposure by the time you get to be really old. It's also important to consider the effects of multimorbidity, polypharmacy, and frailty. Relevant outcomes of clinical trials for older people are not always the same as those for younger people. For example, surrogate markers are rarely relevant. Disease prevention is sometimes relevant, but you need to consider the time to benefit and whether that is compatible with the person's lifespan. Disease management goals, particularly symptomatic disease management, is often a very important outcome. Global health outcomes are important, but multifactorial. And these include things like hospitalization and mortality, as well as the geriatric giants like falls, confusion, incontinence. And there are new tools developed through gerontology research to measure these in validated ways. Goal attainment is an important individualized goal used in some clinical trials in older people. And successful aging could be the ultimate composite outcome. And that means that you aim to optimize the prevention and control of disease, optimize physical and cognitive function, and optimize social engagement. When designing clinical trials for older people, it's also important to think about de-prescribing trials, trials of stopping drugs when the benefit no longer outweighs its risk. These could be purposive or deliberate trials designed to look at the effects of de-prescribing, or opportunistic trials conducted at the end of any clinical trial to see what happens when the drug is stopped. With this information, the prescribing information or drug label should include how to deprescribe the drug and the effects of deprescribing if they're known. It's also important to include frailty objectively in clinical trials. Frailty is an increase in vulnerability due to loss of homeostasis in old age. This should be measured at baseline in clinical trials to make sure that the population is representative of frail older people who are likely to use the drugs, and to conduct subgroup analyses, being mindful of being adequately powered, to look at in frail older people at pharmacokinetics, pharmacodynamics, efficacy and safety, and to include this information on the prescribing information or drug label. Frailty should also be included as an outcome of clinical trials. It is actually very easy to measure frailty from the data routinely collected in clinical trials or in healthcare, and frailty could be again collected opportunistically at the end of any clinical trial through piggyback trials. When measuring frailty, there are a number of validated tools. It's not yet clear which of these relates well to clinical pharmacology of frailty, so the advice is to use one or ideally more of the validated frailty scales at baseline and as an outcome in clinical trials. In conclusion, clinical trials are important to understand drug effects in older adults. They provide less biased information to complement the pharmacovigilance data we routinely collect. Current innovations developing age-friendly clinical trials that recruit older people who are representative of the real-world users of the drug and measure outcomes that reflect what matters most to older people. There is international application, including low and middle-income countries where populations are aging, non-communicable diseases are rising, and clinical trials are increasingly conducted. Thank you.